Donna Tartt is likely to remind one of nothing so much as an English grad student who's been studying too long for her comprehensives. The characters are lifeless imitations of what smart people are supposed to be like, and Tartt is far too impressed with them. Her frequently gratuitous classical and modern literary allusions could have been less grating if Tartt had injected even the slightest hint of self-knowing humor, but her tone is consistently reverent and annoyingly superior. The plot's many inconsistencies, the self-indulgent, high-flown references to classic literature, and the reliance on melodrama make one wish this had been a tauter, more focused novel. The allusions consistently smack of cafe conversation. They're deep, but not too deep. They entice rather than challenge. These are some of the less than glowing reviews of Donna Tartt's 1992 debut novel, The Secret History, and as you may have noticed, there is a theme within these reviews, but we'll get back to that in a bit. For now, let's talk about Donna Tartt and the incredible buzz around her first novel. This book was hyped up to be something huge, and so is its unknown author. Donna Tartt was going on a 20-city publicity tour. She'd been featured in Vanity Fair, M, Esquire, Vogue, Elle, and Mirabelle, and it was public knowledge that there had been a bidding war over the rights to the book, with Knopf ultimately paying out $450,000, not including for the rights to paperback and foreign production, which went for another $500,000 each. She was good in an interview, she was friends with Bret Easton Ellis, and her hair, style, and Louisiana accent made quite a striking image. And yet, beneath all that, who was she? She had no previous novels, and no short fiction worth mentioning predating The Secret History. Sure, her publisher believed in her, but that is the job of the publisher, so that endorsement only counted for so much. But when the book came out, despite her unknown status, the marketing push seemed to have worked. On the week of September 20th, 1992, the novel broke onto the New York Times bestseller list, landing at the number 10 spot. From there, it climbed steadily up the list until the week of October 17th, when it reached the number 3 spot. It maintained the bronze medal position for another week before beginning a decline down the list that would last until the week of November 15th. The next week, it was gone. The book had spent 9 weeks in a row on the bestsellers list and made it all the way up to number 3. Certainly nothing to scoff at for a debut author, and yet, with the amount of excitement that Knopf had generated around the novel, why was it that the book was never able to reach the coveted number 1 spot? Well, for one, she was up against decently stiff competition. Sidney Sheldon was ahead of her both weeks, and although he might not be a huge name for modern readers, he was quite popular in his time. Sheldon's novels have sold over 300 million copies, and he's often listed as one of the top 10 selling authors of all time. The other two authors who kept her from raising further were Anne Rice and Terry McMillan. Anne Rice had just put out another volume of her popular series, The Vampire Chronicles, and Terry McMillan, who'd been working for several years on building up an audience, both through short fiction and 2 previous novels, had put out her book Waiting to Exhale in May of that year. The book hadn't left the bestsellers list since, and ultimately spent an incredibly impressive 26 uninterrupted weeks on the list. The novel was heavily praised and has sold over 3 million copies since its publication. Certainly, it was not an easy top spot for Donna Tartt to grab. But it wasn't all down to the competition. When the book came out, reviews were mixed. Mixed and sometimes scathing. The marketing around the novel's launch made it clear that her publishers wanted her to be included as a member of the literary and intellectual elite, and that The Secret History was to be considered a literature with a capital L. However, it seems to have been this very insistence that raised the hackles of many a reviewer. That alongside one other thing, Donna Tartt's overwhelming use of literary and historical references. Reviewers hated that Tartt had filled the book with so many references. They were called shallow, distracting, indicative of nothing more than entertainment, grating and annoyingly superior. While the marketing side of the industry seemed to believe in the intellectual merits of Tartt's work, the critical side of the industry was wary of being taken in by the unproven debut author. There seemed to be a fear among critics that Tartt was something of an industry plant. One reviewer compared her extensively to a Pop-Tart, saying that she had come pre-packaged but was perhaps not the genuine article. Come from nothing, full of allusions to history, boasting an education from the then infamous Bennington College, which had garnered scrutiny for being the most expensive college in the country, critics were afraid of getting burned by hitching their wagon to her too soon. No one wants to be the foolish critic who couldn't see that the emperor wore no clothes. And so the reviews came in. And while many of them hemmed and hawed about whether the book was any good, there was a consistent refrain of complaint about Tartt's use of reference. And for many readers, this might seem like a fair criticism. On my first read through of the novel, I saw reference after reference, some of which were clearly set dressing, such as the family library at Francis's house, while others I could tell I was supposed to understand or was supposed to look up. Honestly, it felt like homework, and it was quite rare that I actually went to the effort of looking up whatever it was that Richard had just quoted, or found a translation of the Latin, French, and Greek that is scattered throughout the book. And this is as a modern reader, who in most cases was no more than a Google search away from an answer. For readers in 1992, it would have been even more time-consuming to find out just what it was that Tartt was alluding to. So, did the critics have it right when they implied that Tartt was trying to cheat her way into the intelligentsia through the overuse of references? Well, not quite. I certainly won't say that every reference in the novel is essential, there are hundreds of them, but as their use has been given more serious academic consideration, I think the general attitude around Tartt's love for quotation has become more generous. In particular, Francois Paux's article, The Classical Intertext in Donna Tartt's The Secret History, provides a strong argument for their use being a literary tool more than a desperate plea for academic attention. The quotations and references that Tartt uses are ultimately part of her authorial voice, and they are actually a necessary element for the setting and themes of her debut novel. And while they may have initially appeared to be the pretensions of a young author attempting to be taken seriously, I think subsequent analysis has shown this to be a simplified and harsh view. So back to Paux's article. What exactly does he have to say about Tartt's allusions that might convince a skeptic that they are more than intellectual glamour? Well, there are generally 4 ways that Paux categorizes the use of references in the book. I'll list them out first, and then we'll give each one a full analysis. Reason number 1, self-gratification. Reason number 2, realism. Reason number 3, alienation. And reason number 4, the fatal flaw. Now, as you might suspect, the first reason that Paux gives is the one that critics will find least compelling. But to be fair, Paux is using the first reason as explanation, not excuse. Paux is willing to admit, as I think most critics of this book should be, that not every reference in the book is absolutely essential. Some of them are for Tartt's own enjoyment, it seems, and nowhere is this more obvious than in the endless references to T.S. Eliot, many of which I can almost guarantee you didn't catch. For example, the hotel that Henry and Camilla stay at is called the Albemarle, but I bet you didn't know that Eliot stayed in a hotel of the same name when he was editing his poem The Wasteland. Another obscure one is the name of the French professor, Georges Laforge. His name is suspiciously similar to that of Jules Laforge, who was a poet that T.S. Eliot cited as one of his 2 greatest sources of inspiration. Then, although it's not directly in the text of the novel, Tartt dedicated the book to her editor in the same way that Eliot dedicated The Wasteland, calling her editor Il Miglior Fabbro, which translates to the better craftsman. And in the dedication to The Wasteland, Eliot used the same phrase to thank Ezra Pound. Even the name of Bunny seems to be a reference to Eliot. Edmund Bunny Wilson was a 20th century literary critic who wrote about Eliot in his collection of literary criticism called Axel's Castle. Now, are these references important? No. But do they hinder the reader? Also no. For the most part, they're fun Easter eggs that Tartt put in for her own enjoyment. Does it matter if one of the professors says a name that is a tangential reference to Eliot? I don't think so. And even in cases where it might be important, such as the name of Bunny, a major character, I still think that his name is really good for his character. And so, in my opinion, most of the self-gratifying references end up being rather neutral. They don't add much to the novel, but they also don't distract or take away. If you were feeling extremely pedantic as a critic, I think that among these you could point to the name of the hotel and say that giving it a more symbolic or important name would have been an opportunity to add more linguistic and literary depth to the novel. But in my opinion, it just doesn't matter that much. Now, reason number 2, perhaps slightly more compelling, realism. Paux argues that it makes sense on a literal level for there to be so many references made by the characters, saying, here the atmosphere has to be fairly highbrow. Students of the classics do tend, on the whole, to be bibliophiles, and in Henry's case it is stressed at the outset that he is an unusually well-read polyglot. Moreover, a number of Henry's classmates study English or French, which would broaden their literary field of reference. He is saying that, yes, it might seem annoying to the reader that these characters are making reference after reference, but that doesn't mean it isn't accurate. They are on a college campus and are clearly enamored with their own intelligence and knowledge. Not only are these quotes a part of their personas, perhaps crafted intentionally, as in the case of Richard, but it's also a way of proving to each other that they're smart and worthy of being in the group. If this performative view is taken, then when the other characters make references, it's not Tartt's attempt to impress the reader, but their own attempt to impress each other. which I think adds more depth to these characters and their dynamics. Also, as far as realism goes, if you pay attention to which characters make which references, you'll actually find that their allusions add more depth to their characters. Henry, as it turns out, is studying Indian and Egyptian language and religion throughout the book. And even though this isn't one of his seeming areas of expertise, it adds credence to the idea that Henry is always trying to improve himself and expand his base of knowledge. Bunny, although he is most consistently shown watching TV and reading pulp novels, has a predilection for poems and writings related to war. Even his last name, Corcoran, is a reference to an American general, Michael Corcoran, who served in the Civil War. Also, as a bonus Easter egg, General Corcoran died after being thrown from a horse and cracking his skull while he was riding alone, which is a cause of death quite similar to Bunny's. So, when it comes to the realism of the quotes, Paul says, on the whole, the examples quoted play a functional role in portraying the academic world of the Greek students, without contributing anything of importance to the plot, serving to put the stamp of authenticity on the scholarly world of Richard and his fellow students without being odious. So, reason number 2, while slightly more compelling than reason number 1 for the use of references, still doesn't show that they are a necessity. Paul admits that they don't contribute anything of importance to the plot, and while they might tell us things about the characters, there are certainly other ways to accomplish the same goal. For more convincing reasons, we're going to need to take a look at the next 2 arguments. Reason number 3, alienation. From the first time we hear other characters talking about the Greek students, it is clear that they are not popular on campus. Not only do they stay within their own group, but they get into fistfights at parties, and there are perhaps some less than flattering rumors about the twins. They're separate from the rest of the student body, and they have no desire to join what they view as the hoi polloi. Paul argues that the class uses references and allusions as another way of keeping themselves separated from those around them, and in this way, Tartt attempts to bolster the perception that the microcosm in which Richard and his friends live is out of touch with modern reality. This is helped by the frequent use of references to modern things by other students, and in this way both modern and classical references serve a purpose as they contrast both each other and the characters with the rest of the student body. Also, modern references, especially when made by Richard and Bunny, help to show them as being outsiders even within the special group of Greek students. Richard references TV shows such as Gilligan's Island and Green Acres, and is also fond of reading popular literature from authors such as Stephen King and Raymond Chandler. And it's no coincidence that Richard is clearly the character in the group who is most consistently kept on the outside. He's invited neither to the Bacchanalia or to the murder of Bunny. He's kept out of the loop of both logistical and personal issues that the group is facing, and he's frequently manipulated by Henry and sometimes by Camilla. While the quotations might at times separate the reader from the characters, as not every reference will be accessible to every consumer, that is somewhat the point of them. They're not made to feel inclusive, they are meant to feel exclusive, putting the general public on the outside, and perhaps raising a feeling that there is something desirable on the inside. It's this very feeling of curiosity around exclusion that draws Richard into the group and creates a feeling of superiority to those who have not been able to break in. The alienation created by inaccessible language and illusion is part of the cultic undertones of the novel, resulting in a literary tool that, while almost impossible not to notice, might not be obvious in purpose to all readers. And it's this very feeling of alienation and superiority that leads us to the 4th reason identified by Paul. Reason number 4, the fatal flaw. So, where does this constant quoting of Greek and Latin, the references to French poetry, and the name dropping of long dead authors all lead? Well, in a way, it leads to everything falling apart. But before we talk about the falling apart, let's talk about the build-up. To start us off, Paul refers to the original bit of Greek that Francis and Henry say to Richard when he joins the class, and argues that they serve to highlight the arrogance of Henry and his clique right from the outset, and also to demonstrate how they initially aim at perpetuating Richard's ostracism or marginalization. To Henry and the other students, their education is not only a tool to better themselves, but a way of identifying themselves as superior to others. They seem to think that their knowledge of Greek is a sure stamp on the fact that they are more intelligent than those around them, and they use it in order to degrade others and make them feel lesser. This theme is even continued later in the novel when Henry returns from his trip to Rome and uses Italian phrases when speaking to Richard, despite knowing that Richard doesn't know Italian. At that point in the novel, it's unlikely that Henry can still use Greek to separate himself from Richard, and because in that scene he's trying to intellectually intimidate Richard, he pivots languages in order to keep ahead of Richard. Henry also does this at one point by speaking in German to Richard, making a veiled threat that Richard doesn't even pick up. Language and education is again used as a tool of separation and superiority throughout the novel via the use of Greek as a secret code. This use of code is what Paul finds to be one of the most important factors in the conclusion of the novel. Although the students are far from fluent in their ability to speak Greek, whenever they're in a delicate situation, they're able to string together a few words of Greek in order to pass messages in front of unsuspecting commoners. And because they're speaking ancient Greek, not a more common language like French or Spanish, there's no chance that a normal person would be able to break their code, which further inflates the students' egos. And this seems to work out very well for them for the majority of the book. They're able to avoid the scrutiny of the law, and by the end of the book, the only problems they are facing are interpersonal. But there is one final obstacle: the note left by Bunny written to Julian. It needs to be disposed of, and in a climactic scene, Francis and Richard burst into Julian's office while he is speaking to Henry. Francis and Richard need to tell Henry about the letter, but they can't find a way to do so without alerting Julian to its importance. And so in this scene, finally, the one tool that has always been at their disposal in situations like this is taken away. While they're able to get out a word or two in Greek at a time, Julian is fluent, and any type of Greek communication they might try would be instantly decoded. While the students each have their own individual fatal flaws, as a group their shared fatal flaw is their arrogance about their intelligence and education, and this is what defeats them in the final pages of the book. These students, who even when confronted with the police have acted superior, crumble when their education is matched and exceeded by Julian. When their pretensions and false sense of superiority is taken away, they are revealed to be no more intelligent or cunning than anyone else. Paul says, "Thus the wheel has turned full circle. The four surviving members of the classic clique, who once sought to effect Richard's exclusion by means of their highbrow code, are now themselves excluded, together with Richard, by someone better able to utilize the very code once conferring privileged status upon them. Julian, the only remaining insider, ostensibly departs for Never Never Land, while his 5 students become outsiders, exiled to the stringent confines of reality." The separation from Julian which this leads to is presumably the main driving factor in the death of Henry, who is clearly devastated by what he perceives as a betrayal. And it's this separation and the ultimate striking down of the group by Julian that brings so much importance to the references. While the reader is meant to be overwhelmed and perhaps impressed by the amount of references and allusions in the novel, Tartt does not equate this literary familiarity with intelligence, and goes out of her way to show that those well-read characters are not smarter or better than their peers. They are just as fallible. And this is ultimately why the references and allusions of the secret history are worth consideration. They're not meant to be taken seriously all the time. They're not even meant to show how smart characters are. Rather, they are meant to say something about the type of people who use literature and history as a proof of their own intelligence, serving as a critique of the very type of personality that many a reviewer accused Donna Tartt of possessing herself. Conclusion. So, in the end, do the references justify their existence? Yes and no. While it may seem like I've done nothing but praise their inclusion, I think it's a bit more complicated than that. I think that Tartt certainly had criticisms about her characters and the type of people that they're meant to represent. I think she in large part uses references to express those criticisms. I also think that Tartt is one of the people she is criticizing. She has said herself, after all, that she identifies with all of the students and injected a bit of her own personality into each of them. Her inclusion of obscure references to T.S. Eliot also tells us that she harbors a desire to get something past the average reader and is flaunting her education in a sincere way. And the way she speaks in interviews is unsurprisingly similar to the way her characters speak, full of references and unconcerned with the fact that the audience might not understand them. So the critics were not entirely wrong about Tartt. Her references are a bit of a performance, meant to flex her intellectual muscles, but that doesn't mean they don't serve a dual purpose. Tartt is able to simultaneously show off while also using her references as a literary tool which often furthers characterization and plot. One last time, let's see what Paul has to say about it. At first glance, such a who's who's of titles and authors may look embarrassingly like mere exhibitionism. However, as it is spread over 660 pages, such ostentatiousness rarely impedes the flow of the narrative or plot development. No more, at least, than is the case with established intellectual novelists like Bellow, Burgess, and Rushdie. As Paul rightly points out, filling up a novel with references is hardly something new, and many of the great authors of the 20th century were just as guilty as Tartt. Maybe Tartt got more resistance because she was new to the scene. Maybe it was because her annoying undergrad characters were the ones making the references, not some amorphous authorial voice. Or maybe even after listening to all of this, you think it was because she was using them excessively in an inferior way to other authors. Whatever the case may be, I am glad to see that the conversation about their inclusion, as well as the analysis of the initial critical reception of this book, has been given more attention since its publication. So, to wrap it all up, did Tartt need every single reference that was included in this book? No. But if they'd been excluded as a whole, this would have been a much lesser work. Thank you so much for watching. I had a lot of fun making this. Let me know what you think about Tartt's references. I'm sure I know many people, do not like them, but I think on the whole they're pretty fun and they add a lot of depth and enjoyment to this novel.